starting our sermon series for January now, Awkward Conversations, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to have those conversations over the next month. My name's Austin Harris. I'm here today filling in for Pastor Bill as he visits some family down in Texas, and I'm really excited to be worshiping with all of you here today. I'm particularly excited about this being January 1st because it's the new year, and that's a beautiful time because life gives us this great blank slate. It says you can forget the last 365 days and you can start anew. It gives us a new set of pages in that story we call life. And so last night, many of us looked around at the world and our place in it and decided that there was a change, big or small, that we wanted to make in our lives. So I'm curious, how many of us are starting resolutions today or sometime this week? No one. Okay. Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, a lot of us do this, right? And so today we start new diets. We renew those memberships to the gym. We're going to work more or work less, save more money, spend more time with family. And I have a feeling a few of you might be here today because church was one of those resolutions, and we got really sneaky and put it on the first day of the year this year. But we're glad to have you for whatever reason you might be here. I think resolutions are great. I think it's healthy for us as people every now and then to look around and decide whether or not we're happy with the world we find ourselves in. I'm no stranger to this. I love to make New Year's resolutions, and I make one just about every year. Usually, after a month of holiday food and eggnog at 300 calories a gulp, I'm talking about getting a little healthier. You know, the resolutions are how we shed the winter coat, if you will. It's about Christmas time when I walk into my grandparents' house and Nanny looks at me and says, "Austin, are those pants fitting a little tight today?" It's not a subtle hint from the grandmother who I know loves me, but it's an effective one. Last year, this was doubly true. On top of the month of bad food and my winter flubber building up, I had just taken a semester-long class at college, Introduction to Psychology. And in that class, the teacher continuously told us that human beings peak mentally and physically between the ages of 20 and 30. I didn't like that. That wasn't a fun fact for me to continue to be told, and it's not that I'm unhappy with my life or how I look, but if this is the peak, if this is as good as it gets, I want a refund. I want to roll the dice again because that's not okay. So after a depressing semester and a month of holiday food, I was resolved, and my resolution was simple. Eat healthier, lose a little bit of weight, and become the single most attractive man on the face of the earth, right? Easy to achieve. I wasn't that far off, was I? Yeah, there you go, yeah. I mean, the goal was to look a little more like Zac Efron and a little less like the three-chin monster here. And take that picture down as fast as you want. The solution to the resolution was just as simple. Replace fried chicken and sugar cookies for vegetables and quinoa, whatever that is. Go to the gym a little bit more. I decided at an hour a day I would meet my goal in no time. I'd be slim, I'd be fit, I'd feel better, and I'd live better. And I got to tell you guys, I stuck with it for about a week. Yep. It was the gym that slipped first. Now, it wasn't like I worked out for 1 week and decided I had burned all the calories I needed to for the next 360 days. But life's busy. And between school and work and friends and family and this strange little thing called sleep, there just wasn't enough time in the day to spend an hour at the gym each and every day of the week. So it became an hour every other day, and then 30 minutes every other day, and then 30 minutes once a week, and then walking to the car, and then walking to the refrigerator. Because the diet slipped too. Now, I like to eat healthy. I like smoothies and vegetables and fruits, but it's time-consuming and kind of expensive. So as a college student, I can go to the grocery store and get a bag of grapefruit or a month's worth of pizza rolls for exactly the same price. And I think we all know what won that fight. Right? Resolutions are hard to keep sometimes. We get distracted, life gets in the way, but usually we just realize that they aren't that important. They're not going to change our lives. Looking a little more like Zac Efron would have been nice, but it wasn't going to change the way I lived my life. School and a good education, a job I loved, family and friends, those all became more important. And that's okay. But sometimes I think there are resolutions that can change our lives in a deep and important way. Sometimes I think we can look around and see that there's serious change we need to make in the world. we really need to re-examine where we're at and how we're acting. And after 2016, I think especially, there's a lot of change we would like to see. If we're honest with each other, the last 365 days were probably not humanity's finest. Celebrities died. The people that brought us joy and hope and happiness passed away and left a hole in our heart, and they don't all even fit on the screen. And violence erupted. Seemingly day after day, more and more people were hurt, as it seemed like the world was just falling apart around us. And the world ached as we felt the pain and suffering of people in our own community and thousands of miles away. In the midst of all that, it felt like our very society was tearing itself apart. We were thrown into the middle of an election cycle that lasted almost 2 years. And our politicians used that time to throw mud at each other, to cast insults, to create camps, to dig trenches, and build barriers that they refused to move. In the midst of that division and the anger and the spite, it seems that we started to follow suit. Like our leaders, like the people we elect for office, we all have people in our lives that we don't want to talk to. Maybe it's a guy who ripped you off in a business deal 30 years ago. Or a girl who liked a guy that you liked, whether in 1964 or 2016. It's a family member who just sees life through a different lens, and we can't understand it. So instead of saying something we regret, we say nothing at all. It's the coworker who always tries to one-up you, the teacher that refuses to give you an A, the neighbor whose dog barks late into the night. Whoever they are, we all have people that we don't want to talk to, and we don't want to be around. And sometimes we just don't know how to talk to them. We'd like to change things, we'd like to make amends, but we don't have the words to say. We can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we're certainly not going to admit that to them or even to ourselves. 2016 showed us that sometimes we struggle talking to each other. But it's not a new problem for us today. It's something that Christ and the disciples are struggling with in today's scripture. The scripture that RJ read for us finds Jesus and the disciples traveling from Judea to Galilee, or Galilee to Judea, And in John 4, we see them traveling through this region in the middle called Samaria. Now, in ancient times, ancient Israel was divided into 3 regions. To the far north, you had Galilee. To the far south, Judea. And where we find Christ is right in the middle, in Samaria. And to us today in 2016, that doesn't necessarily mean much. But in ancient times, this mattered immensely. We have to understand that the Jews hated Samaritans. This wasn't just a discomfort or a dislike. This was a deep, spiteful hatred that's lasted for centuries. First, we need to know that Jews weren't allowed to marry outside of the religion. And they took this so seriously that if a Jewish man or woman married outside of his or her faith, the family performed a funeral for them that very day. In their eyes, they were dead. They were disgraced to the family line, and so they were buried and forgotten and despised by their own family members. Samaritans, though, married outside of the religion all the time. They did it on purpose, and it was a common occurrence. So to an Orthodox Jew, in the time of Christ, a Samaritan was as low on the ladder as they possibly could have been. So from their earliest ages of comprehension, Jewish boys and girls were taught to hate Samaritans. They were told that if you act like those people, your family will abandon you, will despise you. They were told that the Samaritans were different, that they challenged every aspect of Jewish life. They were from a different place. They worshiped a different God. They have a different religion and a different culture. They weren't people that ancient Jews would have associated with. The disciples and Jesus, too, would have been raised to hate these people, told from their youngest years not to go to Samaria, not to interact with these people. They were too different, too strange, and so you should ignore them. In fact, we shouldn't just ignore them, we should act like they don't even exist. They're barely humans for many of these Jewish people. Yet, we find Jesus and the disciples in the last place they're supposed to be in John chapter 4. Right? They're traveling through Samaria. And I can imagine the disciples in this moment. They're in Galilee getting ready to go back home to Judea, and I imagine they've packed their bags and they mapped out their course, and they know that they're going to go around Samaria because no Jew ever travels through there. That's how deep this hatred is. Instead of traveling through their region, they would add several days of hard journey to go around Samaria. It'd be like you and me wanting to go to Kansas City, but we hate someone in Basehor so much that we're going to drive to Wichita first and come back up. I mean, this is hatred, deep and abiding. A hatred that I think and hope we struggle to comprehend. So here are the disciples, ready to leave, packed up, ready to go, with their map drawn around Samaria. And in walks Jesus. He says, all right, guys, let's get ready to go. And by the way, we're going to go through Samaria this time. The disciples probably laughed a little bit, chuckled under their breath, because it would have been hilarious, preposterous for them as pious Jews to go through Samaria. Then I imagine that eventually they kind of looked at each other and said, oh, I think he's serious. Jesus, especially as a rabbi, is breaking every social norm just by being here. And he does more than that. He doesn't just travel through Samaria, he talks to Samaritans. This is weird, and this is strange. And the part of the story we most often focus on is the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. But there's a deeper story here, and one that I want us to focus on today. It's what the disciples are doing in the book of John, chapter 4. We find our first hint in verse 7. A Samaritan woman came to the well to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me some water to drink." His disciples had gone into the city to buy him some food. His disciples had gone into the city to buy him some food. Most of the time we read this and find it inconsequential. Our gut tells us that that's not where the meat of the story is. We need to focus on what Jesus is saying to the woman. But if we dig a little bit deeper, there's another story here. We read that the disciples have gone into the city to buy Jesus food, and we just see it as a transition in the scripture. But it's a story in of itself. Because while Christ is with the woman, we find the disciples walking into a Samaritan city. These men, who at one time would have been raised to hate Samaritans, who at a point in their lives would have found them to be the lowest of the lows, are going into Sychar to buy food and to buy water. They're talking with Samaritans. They're eating with Samaritans. They're interacting and trading with them. Eventually, as the scripture tells us, they're rejoicing with them. And remember, that's not normal. This is not where the disciples are supposed to be. They're Jewish men in 0 AD, and the times do not support them being here. But they are. They're living out their lives as Christians in an immense way. The disciples had changed. Instead of defining Samaritans as less than, they recognized them as people, human beings who deserved recognition. The disciples had learned Christ's love, and so just as Jesus was talking to a Samaritan woman who had been married 5 times and lived with a man who was not her husband, the disciples are interacting with people who could not have been more different than they were. Just as Christ is showing a woman who had spent her entire life on the outside love and compassion, the disciples were doing what no Jews could have imagined doing. The disciples had changed. The love that Jesus had taught them was transforming how they interacted with the world. And it went so much farther than just traveling through Samaria. The disciples weren't treating Samaritans the way Jews were supposed to treat Samaritans. There's a dramatic change here in the way they view the world. They're living as Christians in an immense and a powerful way. They overcame the barriers that their society had built and showed care and compassion for strangers they never should have met. Their changed mindset is made more obvious later in the scripture. Just then, Jesus' disciples arrived and were shocked that he was talking with a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" The woman put down her water jar and went into the city. She said to the people, "Come and see a man who has told me everything I've done. Could this man be the Christ?" They left the city and were on their way to see Jesus. In the meantime, the disciples spoke to Jesus, saying, "Rabbi, eat." Jesus said to them, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." The disciples asked each other, "Has someone brought him food?" And Jesus says to them, "I'm fed by doing the will of the one who sent me and by completing his work." The disciples had changed. This is a teaching moment for Jesus. The disciples have come a long way, no doubt, but here he solidifies the fact that doing God's work recognizes no cultural or ethnic or racial boundaries. As Christians, the disciples are being charged by Christ to go where they don't want to go, to have awkward conversations with people they don't like and don't want to be around. They're being charged to break down their barriers. And that same charge continues for us here today. Because sometimes life pushes us into awkward moments. Sometimes we're placed with people we don't want to talk to, and we have to have those awkward conversations with them. In those moments, how do we respond? when we're confronted with our bias, when we find ourselves living in an echo chamber, how do we react? And when we see people who are different than us, talk different, live different, act different, how do we interact? Our faith teaches us to overcome our predispositions. It teaches us to join in the love that God has for us all, but more importantly, it gives us the strength to do so. We like to think that we don't have our own barriers anymore. We tell ourselves that we don't hold grudges and that the world's come too far for mere awkward conversations to keep us from making disciples of the earth. And it would be nice to act like everyone gets along, that we have no bias, that our comfort zones are inclusive of all peoples from all walks of life. But if we're honest, we all have barriers that we put up. We all have people we like to talk to and those we don't. Our walls can be benign, but they can also be dangerous. Either way, they're still walls. All we have to do is turn on the news to see that there's still violence and hatred in today's world. And sometimes we can all give in to our fears and lash out at the people around us. But that's not the life that Christ envisioned for us. If we can learn from him and take a lesson from his disciples, we see a different way to live. And imagine a world in which we live out that charge as people of faith. Imagine a world in which we build bridges instead of digging trenches. Imagine a world where we find a way to talk to that old friend, that angry family member, the vengeful ex, the annoying coworker, or the insufferable neighbor. It isn't easy, but I believe that we can live like the disciples. I believe that if we learn from the lessons of Christ, we can walk into our city full of Samaritans and talk to the people that we aren't comfortable with. And we need that kind of love and compassion in today's world. If you're anything like me, you looked around yourself last night, you saw the world, and you said, what can I do to change this? It's a big question, but one that we so often struggle with. I think we start by filling the world with more love. I think we start by admitting that sometimes we struggle talking to one another. And admitting that we struggle to have those conversations is a good first step. But we have to follow it up with actions. We have to admit that we have faults, we hold bias, and we have comfort zones. We have to be willing to go to those places we don't want to go, those places we feel uncomfortable. And we have to find a way to connect to people that we would rather not be around. Because doing God's work knows no boundaries. Showing grace and love to people shouldn't stop with our churches or our friends or our family or our neighborhoods. It should be everywhere, in every aspect of our lives. As Christians, we're called to live out our lives in such a way that all may want to know our God, in every place, under every circumstance, in every way. We aren't meant to pull each other down. We're meant to lift each other up. And everywhere we go, we are called to be the lights shining in the darkness. The disciples were raised to hate the Samaritans. Yet through the lessons that they learned from Christ, they overcame their predispositions, broke down their boundaries, and walked among the very people they should have despised. Can we do the same thing? Do we possess the ability to overcome our own boundaries? I think that through Christ we do. As a matter of fact, I know we do. I know this because we do it every single Sunday. I don't want to shock any of you, but right now, in this sanctuary, you're sitting with people who probably don't agree with you on everything in the world. Right now, in here, every Sunday morning, there's Democrats next to Republicans, young next to old, wise versus learning, and we all interact. We all worship together. We all sing together. We all love God together. Why? Because when we walk into this building, we leave our boundaries at the door. We're not seeing each other based on our house or our income or our ideology or our politics. We're seeing each other as children of God, each of us deserving of love and compassion. We see the beauty in each one of our lives, and when you do that, it's hard to disparage one another. Beautiful things happen in this building because when we walk in, we forget about the things that divide us and focus on what unites us. And so we talk to one another. Your children play with one another. We live life together, and we build memories together. And that shouldn't stop here on a Sunday morning. It's a great skill that we've all built by coming to TUMC, but it needs to follow us everywhere we go. The ability to talk to people and have conversations that don't turn angry or spiteful or draw blood should follow us into our workplaces, into our schools, and into our homes. It should go with us when we're at the gas station or the grocery store, on social media, and in every walk of life. Now, we have to learn from the lessons that the Bible has to share. We have to trust in God, but when I read the Bible, I find a story of love. I see lessons in grace. And when I walk around here on Sunday morning, I see the exact same things. I pray that we can do what we do here everywhere. So this year I'm making a new resolution, and I hope it's one that you'll join me in. Because in 2017, I'm going to start talking to people again. And more importantly, I'm going to start listening to people again. And no matter who I'm talking to, and no matter how much I don't want to be around them, I'm going to do everything I can to remember that they, like me and like you, are children of God. And they deserve my compassion and all the grace that I can muster. And if we can live like that, I think we can learn to get along again. Now we're all going to stand up and start singing Kumbaya, but maybe we won't fight so often. Maybe we can find a little harmony in our lives. And maybe, just maybe, old connections will be rekindled, and the people we didn't want to talk to will become important parts of our lives. Even if they don't, when we live like this, we're living out our lives as Christians. And in that, we will always find hope. Will you pray with me?